Hi, everybody. Shrayana is going to talk about her wonderful book, which, kind of magnifies our national obsession with Shah Rukh Khan and why it is that, so many Indian women especially, I mean, I know many male fans as well, but his fandom is, I mean, like no other hero, Hindi film hero, uh, women really love Shah Rukh. So maybe we could start with your own, you know, passion for Shah Rukh to start with.
Actually, let me start. How many Shah Rukh Khan fans here? Okay, that's. So I have a very funny story to tell you, Manjula. Actually, at the start of the book, the book is non-fiction and it's based on 15 years of research. I followed the lives, as you know, of different women from different parts of the country. And the two things that really unite us are one, our mad, as you described it, passion. Some would call it just fandom for Shah Rukh Khan. And more importantly, the fact that all these women want to have their own economic independence to be able to just purchase their own ticket, have their own mobile phone, so they don't need to seek permission or somebody else's help to be able to just do something as simple as watch your favorite film star. And I think in the book, one of the things you realize, and it's really heartbreaking, I'm in Kerala right now. It's a state that is historically very well known for being much more friendly to women in the labor market. But if you look at the latest statistics, nearly 70% of men hold jobs. The same in urban Kerala is about 33% for women, right? So even in historically progressive states, to be able to watch Shah Rukh is very difficult. So I think the first reason why, to be very simplistic about it, why all these women that I spoke to, or even myself, love this man so much is because it was an expression of our economic muscle. It's an expression of the fact that you can like something and then you have your own space, money, access to markets, purchasing power to just be able to go ahead and enjoy and seek your own pleasure, have your own fun. We are a country, irrespective, I would say, of north or south, that is not comfortable with women having fun. Somehow women having fun makes us very uncomfortable. It doesn't matter whether you're a man, woman. You have experiences and stories in the book where women actually face violence for just watching or organizing a screening of a film or even looking at a song. And I think in that environment, the fact that it's so difficult for you to just have your own fun, Shah Rukh becomes a very different icon, right? Because he symbolizes, I think, for a lot of these women, this constant chase and pleasure and a quest for pleasure that's very difficult for them to actuate. I mean, I think when it comes to him, and recently he won that Indian of the Year prize, and I'm going to quote him, and he actually said that he feels that there is really no difference between analysts and idiots. And I think that's important because I love him too much to analyze him. And I actually say this in the book. I don't think I'm some dispassionate film studies person who can unpack his icon. What I actually did do, and it says, I say this in the second page of the book is not about him, but the book is about these women's lives. But through them talking about him and about why real men disappoint them so much and why they love him so much, we learn a lot about their aspirations. And I think the one thing that's common constantly, I keep hearing this, be it north, south, the poorest woman I met to the richest or poshest woman I met, Manjula, it was the fact that he performs emotional and domestic labor. There's this constant mention of the fact that in his movies, he's constantly in the kitchen, he's helping women pick saris, he's chopping vegetables. In a village in Uttar Pradesh, in this district called Rampur, I was interviewing women who are home-based garment workers, and they earn about a quarter of minimum wage. And all of them said to me, they said, we'd never seen a man chop a carrot in a Hindi film, like the hero chopping a carrot unless he's playing a chef. And this was considered radical, and it's important for us to remember that we right now as a country are in the bottom 5 of the world when it comes to men helping in housework. So the idea that you have this fantastical man who's wildly sexy but is also chopping carrots and helping you with all these domestic chores, I think does speak to a lot of women, and the fact that they would like to be more supported in their intimate roles and their reproductive roles. And I think the last bit, which I think so many people talk about often, and you see this particularly in the middle class and women who are from the emerging middle class in the book, women who are the first in their families to hold jobs, to speak English, to finish an education. They'll say that, well, he was the first person who they knew who made it without networks, right? This idea of making it in such a, what is considered a very nepotistic, network-oriented industry, which, by the way, is no different from the Indian economy. If you look at, intergenerational mobility rates, kids always end up doing usually what the parents are doing. We're not a country which is economically rapidly mobile. And I think in that world, to see a man who has sort of, surmounted all these odds and has reached this stupendous sense of success. I interviewed people who stand outside Mannat because I was very curious. For 10 years, I used to go outside for his birthday celebrations. Partly because I was a fan, but partly because I was just curious, why are you all there? And the one thing that's very important to note, Manjula, is the people standing outside, they're not wealthy, upper middle class people at all. These are people who are actually foregoing a day's wages to just stand outside. It costs you money to be able to go. And for so many of them, the reason they wanted to partake in this experience, I call it middle class Qutub Minar, that's what his house Mannat has become, is because of that story of mobility. This idea that, well, even if the economy is not treating you well right now, if you're unhappy with your job, you're unhappy with your circumstances, there are stories, no matter how mythical they may be, that you can surmount that and you can be economically mobile and successful. And I think people come to actually just look at the house to remind themselves of that possibility in a fairly dark and unequal economy still exists. And this is so much more important for women, right? Given how low our employment rates are for women. Now we're looking at 25% of female labor force participation in 2023. In that world, the story of economic mobility is very important. So it's domestic labor, emotional labor, economic mobility. I think that is the passion that I share and that so many other women, I think, share as well. And then, of course, the fact that somebody said, as I mentioned earlier, he's like the sexiest man alive. So I think that helps.
Okay. So, in that section towards the end, when, you go to Mannat and all these people are standing outside for Shah Rukh's birthday, for that vision of him to appear on the balcony, a lot of them are young men also. Most of them are young men, and the young women, overcome all sorts of domestic odds and get there somehow or the other. And they're a bit intimidated by these crowds of young men who are also there. So those young men, I obviously, as somebody who's written this book, you've thought about them as well. So, tell me, in the book you mentioned that do they take their inspiration from his more kind of violent earlier films, right? Dar, where he's, and even Anjam, which I couldn't watch when I was younger. It was too violent. So is that...
It's interesting, Manjula. I think there's a very lazy way we tend to think about analyzing celebrities. Going back to that theme of analysis and idiocy. I think we seem to think that everybody just consumes wholesale the images that people are seeing. One thing you realize, you could be a fairly uneducated woman growing up in rural Rampur or the forests of Jharkhand, and you see this in the book. You're aware that when he's stalking women, and in your own life when you see men, particularly when you migrate to work on your own, treating you in a way that makes you feel unsafe, that behavior is partly encouraged by that kind of filmmaking as well. They recognize that, and yet they give priority to the more loving images that they want to see, right? So I think people have agency in the way they construct these ideas of stars. And I think for so many of the women I followed, they would constantly, and I think there's a lot of mention of this in the book, that I didn't like him in this, but I love him in that. And I love him when he cuts vegetables and when he talks about women's issues as in interviews so much that is what I will give more energy to. When it comes to the men, and this is something actually for the past year I've been going to, I've been watching Pathaan, Jawan, I haven't yet watched Dunki with a lot of people, but I've been watching them with his fan clubs. And the organized fan clubs, unsurprisingly, because it requires interacting in public space, are very masculine. And one of the policemen outside Mannat, because I asked him, why is it that there are barely any women there? he actually said to me, he said, because women don't have time and women don't feel safe. There's like this tidal wave of men pushing up against you constantly and you feel uncomfortable. And I think in that world, women's fandom is actually much more private, right? It stays within the home. It stays within sort of more intimate spheres of friendships and smaller spaces. And you see that in the book. It's in courtyards and it's in homes. It's not out there always fully in public. For display, I think partly it's also not fully in public for display is because we have a fairly puritanical attitude towards sexual desire when it comes to women. And women coming out and screaming in favor of an actor also suggests that they think he's attractive, and that makes people uncomfortable. And you see this in the book, particularly in the North. There's a lot of policing around what women are consuming. I have one young woman in Delhi. She grew up in a sort of lower middle class family in East Delhi, and her father essentially wanted her to just not watch any of his films. She keeps cutouts that are completely hidden somewhere far away in a scrapbook, which she has to constantly monitor the location of. So that's a story about women. When it comes to men, I think the two things that I discovered when I was watching Pathan and Jawan in rural Bihar with men from fan clubs, I think this strong man, it does speak to men. There's no denying that. But I think there's also a strong man who is open and vulnerable about his feelings. Because even in these movies where he's playing, you know, the protector savior, the action star, he is reporting to a senior woman. In Pathan, his boss is Dimple Kapadia, and she plays a fairly strong woman. And one young man said to me, he said, which man do you know who would ever be comfortable reporting to a woman? You know him. And then I think there is an alternative masculinity that he's fashioning for men as well. And I think the other thing that I think men definitely respond to so much is his economic success. I mean, especially when I talk to middle class men, and I think it's no different from middle class women, this story of economic mobility, it works the same way. So yes, I don't think anyone is looking now or publicly saying to me in this current world that we live in that, oh, we love the stalking and we sort of drew on that. No one's going to say that, even if they did at a point of time. But what they will say is they like this show of strength, but a show of strength with vulnerability. Because at the end of the day, I think patriarchy hurts men the most, right? I do believe that. I think this constant way of telling young boys and young men that this is the way you need to be stoic and strong, I think he's pushing up against that. Because even in the action films, there are lots of scenes where he's beautifully crying tears. Men react to that as much as women do.
Okay, the fact that he shows himself as being sensitive is one thing, but also I think perhaps he occupies a special role because he's Muslim and secular, we know that, and he doesn't hide that. So, if you want to, that's part of his appeal, right?
It's interesting, Manjula, and it's 15 years I've been talking to people about his icon. And the one thing I have to say, nobody ever reduces him to his religion. People may not like him, people may love him, people may think well, but nowhere ever have I heard somebody talk to me very specifically about his Muslimness. And yet, if you look at so many of the women in the book who I follow, they are Muslim women, and they also look up to him as a man who is part of their community. One of them is very angry when he's not vocal about the NRC protests, and she talks about it. She says, why is he not standing with his community? But nobody ever reduces him to these binaries of identity politics. I think people see him beyond that, and I think that's actually a source of tremendous hope, right? I think if you look at the stupendous success of those films this year, they are actually asking us to question our notions of nationhood, our notions of what does it mean to be an Indian citizen in contemporary times. They're questioning those things and those constructs. But they're not being very obvious and in your face in saying, this is identity politics and I am this identity and so on. I think they're actually asking us to move beyond that. And I think his icon has always done that. I don't think you can reduce it to one binary of, religion or not. Nobody ever talks about it. Having said that, though, when the book came out, it came out at a very strange time, I think, in his career. His son, we'd announced the book, and his son, unfortunately, there was very unfortunate set of events involving his son. And I remember at that time when the book was coming out, the amount of hate you saw online, and I really actually think some of it is just completely manufactured online trolling, which in regular, everyday, in-person conversations that I've had about his icon, I've been talking about his icon to everyone I can meet, nobody ever talks about it in that very odious, hateful way. I think it finds expression in online forms of communication, not actually person to person. So I do think he holds a very special place in this idea of his Muslimness and what that means, be it, for example, the whole story about him in that Bombay cricket stadium getting into a massive fight with this security man, because I believe there was an unfortunate comment made about his religious identity. But even there, you see him react to it, and you see him going to TV shows, and I mentioned this in the book. He goes to TV shows, and people cross religion, cross class are clapping in support of him. And I think he has actually shown us this glimmer of space and hope where we can surmount these ideas of identity politics and think of people beyond that. And I think we do that for him, and I hope we can do that more for each other as well.
Okay. Why do you think that nobody else has been able to occupy that space?
No one's as attractive as he is that No, I think a couple of things. I do think, I've actually said this in the book, which is he became, I think, a star at a very important time in the Indian economy. I think, people often talk about him as a Nehruvian hero. I often say he's Manmohan Singh's hero. And what I mean by that is, if India's economy had not liberalized, right, and suddenly television channels were not exploding, suddenly the need for content on TV was not required in the 1990s, I don't think you would see his icon be what it is. Because if you look to a lot of young people, especially in the 90s, who absolutely love him, they will constantly report his interviews. And, this is a very unusual thing. Now it's very common because actors are constantly talking to us on social media. But we must recognize that he was the first personality who felt so proximate and close to us, because he was so open in his interviews, talking about his family, his debt, his parents, losing his parents. He was so open about his personal life. And I think a lot of that essentially helped cultivate him to be the star that he is. None of that would have happened, Manjula, had it not been for that particular moment in our economic history, right? Where suddenly the economy opened up. Suddenly there was Pepsi to sell. So then he could do an ad for Pepsi, right? Suddenly there was this new television channel, and suddenly he could have interviews with Tavleen Singh talking about monogamy and Muslimness and being middle class on these particular TV shows. So I think it's that very important moment in the history of our country's economy when aspirations really just let loose because of what happened in terms of reforms. And I think he will always to us be that sign and signature of liberalization. And I think many of us are nostalgic for it. We look back to that time as a time when we all know something very radical happened in our country. And I think he will always hold that place, partly because of how he ushered that in, and he, in a way, captures a lot of what was happening with the reform process in his icon, right? Like right from the way he dresses, his interviews, what he was saying. So I think that's one very key reason beyond all the other reasons that we just discussed in the beginning.
Also, I remember in your book, one of the young men, I think, saying that uska dimag hai, it's not just his body. So, it's not just his looks.
And those are the interviews, Manjula, and that's the thing. I mean, I think if we hadn't been doing those interviews, how would we even know? And there have been celebrities in the past who would be wonderful orators. Like Shashi Kapoor has great interviews, but he was stuck on Doordarshan. There weren't enough channels out there who wanted to relay him to us. I think the fact that the economy pushed itself in a certain direction pushed him closer to us to tell us about his dimag and his feelings and his personality.
So now, going to the practical bits about writing this book, you've stuck with it for so many years, and you've built relationships with all the people all the women especially, who are mentioned in the book. So talk about the afterlife of that as well. You've kept in touch with them, and what's happened, and what is the star's reaction to the book, and all that.
Yeah, so after the book came out, I think 6 months after it won the Times of India prize, and a month later I got this sudden message from his manager, which I initially thought was a joke, saying, if you're in Bombay, come give us the book. And I initially thought, Manjula, that I was going to go meet the manager, that I was meeting Pooja. But it turned out when I showed up to Mannat, it was actually him. And that was very special. And the paperback edition, which I think is floating around, has a little note from him because he wrote a little note for all the women who were featured in the book and for me, thanking us for putting him to good use. Because he understood that the book was not about him, it was about women in the economy. And he's, in a way, a research method that helps us explore that in a more open and accessible way. And I think he respected that. I think he enjoyed it a bit. And I think he responded to that. So that was very special. The women in the book, and Manjula, you can't write this kind of book because of ethical norms, and particularly it's non-fiction. You can't write this book without the people who are actually writing about being part of the process. So every year, everyone I was interviewing, and this is a 15-year journey, I had to send notes back. Many of the women don't even read English, so I had to translate them and go and do almost like a Hindi movie style narration because I had to tell them how they were being represented. And there are very strict norms around anonymity, what you can keep and what you cannot. They had edits and suggestions to protect them further, and I had to implement those across the board. And so to me, I think they're co-creators of this book. And one of the things we've done is a third of the earnings from the book, we've set up a fund with SEVA. SEVA is one of the country's largest labor unions for informal working women. And one of the things we've done is that fund will essentially allow them to either finance scholarships or it'll allow them to finance if they want to go watch a movie. Just something creative that all of them can do together. So I think the life of the book will probably be moved through that fund and those relationships that continue. And yeah, the reaction in particular, I think everyone was pleased with the books, the fact that people were reading the book and so on. But I think women, particularly from the precariat, really responded to it when it reached Shah Rukh. I think that was a very big moment in the life of the book for them, for me, for everyone. And the journey continues.
Okay. So, the women you've spoken to and even the men you've spoken to, out of these, I found gold. The girl from Bikaner, Jaisalmer, and who moves to Delhi and who then becomes an air hostess, and she's constantly searching for love, like everybody. And but she meets so many, obstructions, and she has to run away from home. But always, whenever she's in her terrible moments, she conjures up the image of Shah Rukh, and and that gets her through, and eventually her her life is happy now. So talk about how, I was struck by how you met her first and how you pursued her,
Yeah, actually, I think one of the things I should sort of really highlight, key theme I think in the book is, I'm trained as an economist, and often when economists talk about, well, why is it that we see these massive gaps in our labor force when it comes to women? And these are enduring gaps. I mean, they've just been persistent for a very long period of time. India is one of the very few countries where even despite having a rapid period of economic growth, women's employment rates actually started to decline. So an anomaly that way. And one of the reasons, economists would say, well, partly it's fertility, partly it's, women are marrying later, so now they get married later, but they're studying more, so they're not working, they're studying much more. There are also issues about the nature of our economic growth, the kinds of jobs that grew. There's essentially data which shows the top 10 fastest growing sectors, only about 19% of jobs in them have gone to women. But I think there's a larger story there, which is, I think, part of the reason why so many women will withdraw or will think twice about thinking about a job as a career is what we call emotional taxes. This idea that when you start to deviate from norms, right, when you say, I will value my role as an office worker or as an artisan much more than my role as a mother or a daughter, suddenly, or a girlfriend, for example, suddenly there are all these emotional rents that society will impose on you. These are not taxes we pay in rupees, these are taxes we pay in feelings. You're made to feel lonely. So many women in the book will constantly tell you, and I hear this constantly in the journey of the book, it's so bloody hard for women who are professionally successful to find men who they actually want to pair up with. It's becoming very, very difficult in the mating market. There's a study recently economists did of online matrimonial sites where basically you find that if you have a job and it's a job of a certain successful level, the interest that families have in your profile, the boy's interest declines, right? And there are these different taxes. So it could be taxes in the dating and mating market. It could be taxes in feeling lonely, in feeling unsupported. And I think Gold is a beautiful example of that. She was supposed to get married through an arranged marriage. Her family really wanted her to marry a person from her own community. She decides she'd rather just go have a job and she wants to be independent, and she runs away. And she runs away from Rajasthan and goes to Gurgaon, where she works eventually as an in-flight attendant, and she has this long career. And it's a lonely career. She enjoys her freedoms, but at the same time, she feels the brutal loneliness of it because she's walked away from all the structures that she knew that gave her a sense of succor and safety, right? So she's having to create that for herself. And I think in that world, she relies on Shah Rukh. Just as release, for comfort, for entertainment. I don't think he's her hero per se in sort of helping her navigate that. I think she has to navigate it on her own. But she does rely on him when the loneliness of life really hurts her. And I think he's sort of a sliver of hope and fun and release. And then she has to get back to the work that she's actually doing, which is to try and be an independent woman in North India, in Gurgaon, where housing markets, job markets, men you're dating are all hostile towards you. And I think in that world, he plays that role of release. How I met her was I met her at a club, at a disco in Delhi. And she had picked a massive fight with this man she was dating at a point in time, who had shown up there with another girl. And she was surprised to see him, and she was very upset. And she started crying, and she created a big scene. And I won't give it away for those who haven't read the book. You should just read the book to see what the scene is. And after this big fight that she has, she and I started talking. And she was smoking a cigarette, and I asked her if she was a Shah Rukh fan, because I wanted to tell her that maybe she could watch a song and it'll calm her down. And she said, I watch him every night. And that's how actually we started talking about what Shah Rukh meant to her. And you realize in the book, and this is not just true for Gold, this is, I think, the power of Hindi cinema and the power of his icon. Nobody actually talks about him, they talk about themselves. Immediately they're talking about why is it they love a certain song. It's because it speaks to a certain moment or period in their own lives. And they use it as a way to almost construct an oral history of their own working relationships and their own relationships with their families, their loved ones. And that's how I followed Gold. And we won't give away what happens to Gold for those who haven't read it, but Gurgaon is a very bizarre place to be a single woman. I think I'll just, and the book is a testimony to that. I think her story is.
Okay, what's different about your book is that you've packed in like hard economic facts and, insights with fandom. It's an unusual combination, and you've done it very well. So, do you want to talk about the challenges that you faced while you were doing that?
I have to say the book was written is a bit of, it was in resistance to the way I feel traditionally economics is written. I feel like economists have for so long been proud of how boring and dull their books are. So the more dull the book is, the more serious it is, and the more difficult it is to read, the better it is. And I really, really, really wanted to write a book of economics that non-economists, I had my grandmother in mind, who is this Bengali woman who keep complaining that why is it that all you Bengali economists, you write about us, you write about our jobs and our lives, but I can never understand a single thing that is written on the page. And she said, she's the one, actually I owe a lot of my reading habits to her and my writing habits to her. She was very close to me. And I remember just thinking when I was writing the text, Manjula, that anything I say should be accessible to her. And one of the things, I think a trick I kept in my head was I wanted to write it with the lightness of a Bollywood film. So you see the rhythms of it there. Like there's a musical piece in the book. The data should feel easy and accessible. I think women, I really, really wanted this book to essentially reach young women. And for so long, and even now, young women tend to be very scared of economics, scared of numbers. We're sort of taught that that's sort of a different domain. Things are changing, but I still think we have a long way to go. And I think in that world, I wanted to write it in this way, which had humor, had lightness, but it still had economics. And I think, Manjula, what's happened as a consequence, the book's now been out, it's been 2 years now, it's coming up to be 2 years. And what's interesting is economists have actually really taken to the book. There's a Nobel laureate who's, endorsed the book. And so economists have really enjoyed the fact that it's trying to write economics in a different way. But what's interesting is, there's like that character of the conservative Indian uncle, right, who tends to read a lot of Indian non-fiction. And I'm sorry if I'm upsetting or offending anyone here who conforms to that
Any
type.
Indian uncles.
Yeah, most Indian uncles who like to read like military history and economics in that boring way. It seems to have really bothered them a lot because I go to book events constantly and I'll always meet someone who I think one feels somewhat attacked by how did you put sex and Shah Rukh Khan in a book about economics? I mean, that's not allowed. And the other thing I keep hearing from them is, well, but the numbers are just all wrong, but it's government data, so the numbers are not wrong. I mean, be it right, left, center, whichever political leaning, the fact that India has an abysmal crisis when it comes to women in the economy is a fact that across political spectrums everybody accepts. And I think somewhere partly they feel attacked by it and partly they feel that the style of the book, because in a way, I do think, the book is about women, but it's also about men. What does it say about men in contemporary India if so many of these women are looking to a mythical hero, right, in cinema, as a way to make actual everyday masculinity tolerable? I think it says something really dangerous and very sad, and I think it is a reckoning. I think it is a time that men all took themselves out to dinner and asked themselves some very tough questions. I think the book pushes them to do that. And so some like it and then some don't. So it has that I've noticed it with the book, it has this sort of extreme reactions on the extreme. And so that's been interesting. But I do have to say, I think the economists who I know from, Professor Abhijit Banerjee to Professor Ashwini Deshpande, wonderful development economists have been nothing, Professor Devki Jain, they've just been nothing but extremely kind and supportive to the idea of writing this in the way it was written. And I was very, honestly, if that was my one political project with the book, which is I wanted to unshackle the writing of data and the economy from conservative Indian uncles. I wanted a more peopled, humorous, joyous way of talking about some very serious, rigorous issues. And the book is heavily researched and based on theory. But I wanted it to be accessible to my grandmother. I wanted it to be accessible to Shah Rukh Khan. I wanted it to be accessible to all the women I interviewed as well. I wanted them to feel like they could actually consume it and understand what was being said. I was against this very alienating style of writing economics. And I think the book to me, in whatever effort I've been able to make with it, and I think whatever efforts I make in the future with my writing, will always be somewhat of a pushback against writing the economy a certain way. And we'll see where that lands. So far, so good.
Okay, so what are you working on next? Is it connected?
It's called The Tyranny of the Indian Uncle. I'm following the lives of middle-aged men. Some of them are in Kerala, some of them are in Udaipur, some of them are in different parts of the country. One of the things, I think, this book ends with this idea that it's very difficult for women to join the labor force, and it gives you a sense of what that means, to just become a worker, a paid worker. But one of the things that I was really interested in exploring is, well, when you become a paid worker, how do we decide what your wages will be, your working conditions? Who is deciding the worth and value of your labor, right? And to give you an example, to go back to gold, she said to me, in a world where we live right now, where people are peeing on flights and treating in-flight attendants so poorly, she says, isn't my job dealing with people as valuable as the job of a pilot dealing with a machine, right? And he or she is in there, and yet pilots are paid so much more. The wage differentials are high. And I think it's an interesting cognitive question, right? Who decided that productivity looks a certain way, labor value looks a certain way? I was very curious about how these decisions were made, and I started asking, just for the past 2 years, I've been interviewing about 100 people, and I asked them, they're in different professions, and I said, who makes these decisions for you? Whether you will get a wage increase, what your wage is, what your job will be, who decides so much of your economic condition? And when you start to follow the chain, you realize usually it's upper caste man between the ages of 42 to 63, it's typically the age group, often schooled from fairly prestigious institutions. There's some IIM there, there's IIT there, that's the median response. And I was very curious about the cognitive mindset of these men. These are the men who will tell us they're against affirmative action. These are men often who will also tell us that they don't want minimum wage, they don't like Narega. I interviewed some of them. There are fears that, if women start working, they'll leave their husbands. There are all these kinds of concerns. And so I wanted to write a story about what's happening to middle-aged men, because I think our society is changing tremendously, our economy is changing tremendously. And I think structures that used to give them affirmation and power are slowly crumbling and changing. And I was curious about that. So it's called the tyranny of the Indian uncle because I'm curious to explore their tyranny in the way I can find a house. You know, the property markets are heavily mediated again by exactly the same profile of men. I was curious about the way wages are arbitrated, what work is considered worthy and valuable and what is considered unproductive and not. And that's the tyranny that I'm interested in exploring. So I'm exploring their lives. And yeah, it'll take me another 10 years because I don't think anything less than 10 is rigorous enough. So.
Okay. You know, one thing I found very interesting in your book, it was just a little paragraph where you point out that, you know, when women become pilots or they do something exceptional for, you know, in the known scheme of things, when they become pilots instead of air hostesses, they're treated very, very differently in
You become a
India.
man in a way.
So talk about that.
You know, it's interesting because I keep hearing this that, well, oh, you know, the problem with the labor market isn't just men. Of course not, it's men and women. Patriarchy is, you know, it's not about, it's about power relations, right? And what's interesting is I keep hearing this, and by the way, this is true, you know, we're talking about non-fiction books, we're at a literature festival. This is true for books, and I think you and I have talked about it before. If I wrote this book about, you know, women who are business leaders, right, or like champions, it would immediately land, I think, much easier with that conservative uncle, because I think so long the conversation on gender is just champions and victims. And I think that's a conversation that a lot of us are comfortable with, because it sort of avoids the really difficult questions in the middle. But I'm interested in the missing middle. I think that's the question that we should really be asking. And I think what's interesting, you know, in the way our economy is architected, and I'm using the example of nonfiction as just one end of a very small section of that economy, is that, you know, for too long, the arbitrators and producers of taste have had a very masculine mindset of what is considered serious, rigorous work. You know, it's a very stuffy kind of masculinity that's shown up, right, in these spaces. And I think the more queer communities, the more, you know, the use of popular culture, changing the language, feminizing it a lot more, it brushes up against that. And I think it's not just, by the way, it's not just men and women. Sometimes women will be very uncomfortable with that. And you were telling me how some of the women you know read the section from the Aristocrats and have very strong reactions to it. I've had some very interesting reactions from lots of women in the book because they feel that we're attacking, I don't know, their husbands or their men or something like that. But it's interesting that in that world, I think this question of whose mindset, bodies, and insights are privileged is, I think, the really interesting question. And I think that's really where I feel a lot of these questions about who decides worth and value become important as well again.
Okay, now should we throw it open to questions?
Thank you, ma'am. My question is as a man. To start with and to be brief, the man in me was brought up by women, by my mother and my sisters. I find that certain definitions are different for a man and a woman. There was this word in the topic today, intimacy. Yeah. I want to know what intimacy is for a woman. I'm asking as a man because I see that something as little as opening a door means a lot to a woman. My own sister didn't know that men can tie her shoelaces till she was 27. So yeah, it's sad.
I'm using that. That's a great example.
I see that from women I talk that they sound deprived of that word. Yeah. Could you explain to a man what intimacy is to a woman?
Showing up in the kitchen. I cannot. It's as simple as, let me finish and then you can, because I think we should give others a chance as well. I think, you know, it's as simple, honestly, as if we look at the history of labors that women are constantly asked to perform, the constant labor of knowing what your needs are, right? Constantly second guessing what you need, responding to that. There are working women I know who I followed in the book who are, you know, geniuses based on sort of their CVs, and yet when they're at work, they're constantly worried about the list that needs to be maintained, about the groceries at home, because they can't rely on men to help them, right? So I really want to highlight that domestic labor and the role of domestic labor in understanding intimacy, at least for a lot of women that I have met and followed, is absolutely central. So that's one. I think the second, I often say that India liberalized for its men. I mean, if you look at, remember the data we were just talking about, look at the number, even in this state, 70% jobs for men, 33% jobs for women. That's a huge gap, right? In India, I mean, I think at the national level, it's only about 25% right now, female labor force participation rates for women in the country. I think intimacy for a lot of independent women is acknowledging how bloody hard it is for them to actually hold space in the labor market, listening to them, not interrupting them with a counter question or constantly sort of, like everything is not a debate. I think, that idea that I just mentioned to Manjula to just take yourself out to dinner, take a little bit of time, read Meena Kandaswamy, read Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh, like read a lot of women authors and ask yourself some tough questions. I think that process is intimacy. Wonderful if you open doors and then, men can learn how to tie their shoelaces and hopefully you can like cook a lot as well and yummy food, hopefully. But I think to me, that question of asking yourself, are you genuinely empathetic to what is happening to this first generation of women who are daring to be economically independent in a society that really doesn't want women to be economically independent? And I think if you're on that path, that is the path to intimacy. And if you can show up in the kitchen, that's even better. And we'll talk more later thank you.
Good evening, ma'am. I'll be very honest and admit that I haven't read your book, but I'm truly looking forward to it, especially after this discussion. And I'll also be very honest in admitting, with fear of being massacred by the extremely ardent fans of Shah Rukh, I'm not particularly a fan of the man on screen, or rather in movies. Having said that, I adore him when he's not acting in movies. I love the charisma that he comes across with when he's, say, giving an interview, or the orator that he is. I'm truly a fan of that version of him. So based on your very strenuous, rigorous research, what version of Shah Rukh does the lonely woman truly seem to be attracted to? Is it the filmy Bollywood version, or the one, of...
So I'm going to give you the ultimate social science cop-out answer, which is actually the true answer. It depends on what class, circumstances, and location you occupy. And you'll see actually the full spectrum of it in the book. For example, when I talk to women who are elite, anglicized, have been from families where English has been the language that they're very comfortable with, especially in the North. For them, the interviews, the way he's showing up in lectures, there's one woman who I follow, I call her the accountant in the book. She's the first woman in her family to ever have a job. She fights to hold on to that job, and it's a very prestigious job. It's a job in the Delhi government. She's in the account services of the Delhi government. That's why she's the accountant. She's very proud of the fact that she has this job. And yet her family is just not interested in her career or listening to her about her office issues. They are only interested in getting her married, right? And in that world, she keeps a scrapbook as well. There are many women who maintain these diaries and scrapbooks of Shah Rukh's quotes. And she has quotes from all his interviews. You ask her for even now, whenever I have a bad day or something and I'm in touch with her, she will give me a quote of his as a response. And she can, you'll see it in the book, there are just quotes and quotes. And for her, he is not an actor, he's not a celebrity, he is a self-help guru. That is actually the way her relationship with him has become. That, anytime she's looking for guidance in her career, when she's feeling lonely, heartbroken, she will recite something that he said at Yale or something he said just at the recent award ceremony, right? And I think that's a relationship for people who have a lot of access, easy access to mobile phones. This is where class, all of that is so important. Easy access to mobile phones, easy access to English, because many of these speeches are also in English. Also easy access to Hindi, because some of the other ones are in Hindi or some mix of Urdu, right? That's the language. And I think for them, those interviews play a very central role. The moment you start moving to the precariat, there's a woman in the book who's a migrant domestic worker who I've known for 10 years of my life, who migrated from Jharkhand to Delhi for her job. She's a full-time domestic worker in a home. She's never had a television in her house. She's never even had a room to herself in her house. Suddenly she has this space to herself when she's working, she happens to see the TVs on. She sees Shah Rukh for the first time when she starts working in Delhi and she loves him. And the only thing she knows about him are his songs. She doesn't even know the movies. She hasn't had the time. Remember, when we were talking about India being in the bottom 5 when it comes to men doing housework, what that means is most Indian women, as economists would call it, are very time poor. We don't have that much time for fun, for rest, for leisure. And these women, the women from the precariat, more so. And so for her, she just doesn't have the time, the access. So for her, it's actually the big, soppy, open arms. She just loves that. She's Christian. She skips church on Sunday. You'll see it in the book to actually be able to watch some of his movies. And she lies to her friends and all of that just to be able to see one Sunday matinee show that her madam, who she works for, her employer, has allowed her to see on TV. Because the idea of spending money to go watch a film in a cinema hall is too exorbitant for her. She needs to save and send money back. So I think the answer to your question is the interviews play a very significant role. And I would actually say you are a fan of the man, because clearly I can tell that you respond to his interviews. You just don't know it. But I do think that that really depends on the social profile of the person who's watching and their income profile and comfort with language. I think that's very important. Yes, I think there's a question there.
Yeah, so I sort of have like a very opposite reaction to that in terms of like the interviews that I've seen of Shah Rukh Khan versus the performance that he has with like his acting is very different persons what they stand for. So, for instance, you spoke about intimacy and sharing domestic work. That's something that we've essentially seen Shah Rukh do in his movies, right? As opposed to this, there are interviews like a Simi Grewal interview where he says something about his wife wearing something, and I'm not sure if you know about it, but that is a very patriarchal way of him speaking about it, right? So when we do really speak about Shah Rukh, like how do we reconcile the fact that there is this, should we make a demarcation that this is the charisma that we're getting from the interviews is more of a,
Darling, I think, do you want to go ahead and finish? But I have a feeling where you're going to land. So I'm going to actually quote him again on analysis and idiocy. I think a couple of things, and I was mentioning this to Manjula. People are smarter than I think, viewers are smarter than I think we give people credit for. So many of the women I followed will tell me, it doesn't matter how educated they are. They'll say, I hate the stalker. They don't even know the interviews. They haven't seen Simi Grewal. But I love it when he's like kind and loving and supportive to women. People can pick and choose, right? And this we can do in our lives. There's no reason why others can't. Having said that though, there are also recent interviews where he's cooking chicken for his wife. And so I think probably you haven't followed like the history of all his interviews as closely as some of the mad fans have, but there is enough of a balance where people can constantly pick and choose. And I'm not one, I hate actually this kind of unpacking and deconstructing of cinema stars, because I think in a way they're very complex constructs to try and unpack. What you can unpack is what that star allows you to say about yourself. So for example, the woman I was just talking about, she started telling me I started skipping church to watch these movies. And I was just fascinated by that. And I thought, why? What is so wonderful about these movies? Because not going to church in her community is very dangerous, because this is at a time in our country where she didn't still have a proper mobile phone, and the church is what gives information back from Delhi to Jharkhand that she's okay, everything's fine. You have to show up to church. It's not just for prayer, but you have to show up to church just to sort of send messages back home. So to not go is a huge risk for her. She did it because she told me that no one will ever look at me with that kind of love. And she felt that that was very important to her. And that led us down a story of what that love means to her. She has this beautiful line, I'll never forget it. She says, there's a film called Rab Ne Bana Di Jodi, where there's a song where he's serenading a tiffin, which his wife has made for him in a song. I'd urge everyone to watch this movie. And she says, no man, she said, ideally I wish all men would love the tiffin that their wives make or their mothers make for them as much as he does in that song. Would she watch that Simi Grewal interview that you're talking about and say, well, I didn't like that? Sure, but she hasn't seen it. And I think we should give everyone that space to sort of, figure out where. I don't think we should be, there is no prescriptive way of understanding these very complex constructs. This is not a supply and demand curve, right? This is very different. And I think in that world, he allows spaces for people, be it cooking chicken or doing Jawan, to interpret him in whichever way they like. But I think the interesting thing to me is not so much the interpretation, that's for film studies people. I think the interesting thing for me is what stories about ourselves as a society does that allow us to share and tell each other. Because there are women in the book right now, the history of this book is actually, when I went to do a survey in a low-income settlement in Ahmedabad in 2006, I was supposed to go and ask all these young women about, they were all home-based garment workers earning about a quarter minimum wage. I was supposed to ask them about their working conditions. How many hours do you work? How much money do you make? It's a very boring standard economic survey. And these women just looked so bored. They said, all you girls, they used to call me survey wali didi, and they said, all you girls come to us with kajal in your eyes, often Malayali or Bengali, and you ask us lots of questions, and nothing happens, right, after that. So what's the point of these surveys? And they said, can we just talk about something else? And I think to ease the conversation, I started asking all these women about their favorite actor, and they mentioned Shah Rukh. And what is amazing about this icon is not, I think, this question of deconstructing him using sort of post-colonial and anthropological lenses. But I think to ask yourself how fascinating that an icon allows someone who is so different from, say, this young woman who's a home-based worker in Ahmedabad, to have a conversation which is an equal and flatter conversation on men. Because for too long, research has just been done by privileged people who have tremendous power, asserting that power and boring people who don't have that much power with their very boring questions. And I'm very grateful to Shah Rukh Khan that he allowed me to not bore people because they were happy to talk to me. And I think the 15 years, I think to your question in the beginning, why did this research persist? It persisted because people was a joyous form of research. And I think if we think about using icons in those kinds of ways, I mean, to me, I'm much more interested, and perhaps my skill set is much more aligned to that. And then people can interpret them in magically different ways, and I think it's wonderful. Thank you.
In the front row.
Hi, my name is Ajna. So I want to ask you how, when it comes to like appreciating a star or a singer, there is some amount of volatility that you see in terms of like how much a person likes them. I personally, and I also see that a lot of others, do not have this kind of volatility when it comes to Shah Rukh. You see something that you don't particularly like about Shah Rukh on social media, for instance. Recently, there was this interview that was trending about how he spoke about Katrina, for instance. My instinct was to avoid it and go seek for content which I know would make me like him. I'm sure this exists for other heroes as well. But in your experience of speaking to so many people, have you been able to understand why Shah Rukh holds this kind of power that a lot of other actors or stars in India do not hold? They can be cancelled just like that.
Yeah, I mean, Manjula asked me this question, I think, right in the beginning. I do think we really, a couple of things. One, the agency that you and I hold, right, to sort of swipe images and go here and there. Most people in the country who love him, and there are lots of people in the country who love him who don't have our privileges of just, a mobile phone of our own, for example, just something as simple as that. For a lot of them, they're actually desperately seeking any image. And the book is called Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh, and you'll see this, especially in villages, in Mufassil areas. The ability to just watch him on your own in itself is so incredibly hard for so many women in our country. Remember, the latest National Family Health Survey data shows 22% of men in the country, and this is a representative sample of the country, 22% of men in the country report watching one film every month in a cinema hall. For women, it's 8%. So I think that should tell you that you and I are part of such a privileged minority that we can actually go and just watch something, right, that anytime we like. So I want us to always be very cognizant of that when we talk about fandoms, right? Because fandoms sometimes for extremely precarious people can just be having access to a magazine cutout, and that is enough, right, with a quote on it. Having said that, though, I do think that his role in our country's economic history, liberalization, I think his role as a softer, gentler masculinity, and I think to the question the gentleman asked earlier, a very alternative definition of masculinity, especially in his sort of later roles. And someone said to me, even when he plays the stalker or the toxic male who says things like, "Chhe din mein ladki in," Then there are all these other scenes where there's like copious tears and this constant emotional engagement. I measured dialogue time. I mentioned this in the book. I measured dialogue time in his films that women have versus films in other Hindi cinema's biggest hits. Women just speak much more in his movies. And I think this thing about listening to women, to engage with them, I think that is actually the reason why, especially in a society that actually wants us fairly silent, right? It pretends it wants us to talk, but it actually doesn't. It can't handle it when we actually speak our truths. And I think in that world, to see this icon, this beautiful image of this beautiful man, listening to women, crying their tears, and also sharing in some of those very core traits of femininity as well, and appreciating them, I think speaks to everyone class. And I think that's probably what holds everyone together. But I do want you to know, for most people, just the ability to just watch a film once in a year is the height of their fandom. And that is incredibly difficult for so many women. And I think the book will give you a flavor of that. Thanks.
Okay, I think, are there any more questions or? There's one more there. But unfortunately, it seems time's up. So
We can talk later. Yeah.
you can talk to her afterwards. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you too.